My family kicked me out of the family business on Thanksgiving. Later, they begged me to come back. My name is Eldon. I'm 34 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my life revolved around two things: my family and the family business. From sweeping the floors of the old mill my grandfather started to working late nights crunching numbers and optimizing supply chains, I poured everything into it. It wasn't just work, it was my identity, my future, the bridge I constantly tried to build towards my parents' approval. We were the Whitmores. We built things. We were successful. And I was supposed to be a part of that legacy. My brother, Vernon, was 4 years older than me, charismatic, charming, good at talking the talk. But he never had the same dirt under his fingernails dedication to the business that I did. He was the golden child, effortless in my parents' eyes. While I was figuring out inventory management software, Vernon was at the country club networking. While I was negotiating with suppliers, Vernon was charming potential clients over expensive lunches. It stung, of course. Every casual praise for Vernon, every slightly dismissive comment about my own long hours felt like a small cut. My parents, especially my father, had a way of doing it, a specific look, a shrug, a phrase like, "Eldon just likes to tinker," as if the complex operational improvements I implemented were just a hobby. My mother would often smooth things over, but her solutions always involved me making concessions for the sake of family harmony. I tried to talk to them, to express my desire for a clearer role, for recognition. But I was always met with the same wall of gentle dismissal or outright gaslighting. "You're too sensitive, Eldon," my father would say, his eyes already glazing over. "Vernon needs support, he's stepping into a leadership role." The goalposts always seemed to move, and I was always just short. Despite the growing unease, I clung to hope. I believed in the potential of the business, and I believed, naively, in the enduring power of family. Last year, I'd spearheaded a project that saved us a significant amount of money, finding efficiencies no one else had seen. I thought, surely, this would prove my value. But the credit was vaguely assigned to the team, with Vernon conveniently positioned as the figurehead who guided it. It was demoralizing, like running a marathon only to have someone else handed the medal at the finish line. My stomach was a coiled snake most days, tight with a mixture of anxiety and frustration. This Thanksgiving felt different, though. The invitation was framed with extra warmth, extra emphasis on the whole family being together. A tiny, desperate part of me wondered if this was it, the moment they'd acknowledge my years of dedication, perhaps even announce a significant role for me alongside Vernon. It was a foolish hope, a last ember in a dying fire, but I held onto it as I drove to their house. The house smelled of roasting turkey and something else I couldn't quite place, maybe the expensive candles my mother liked, or maybe just the stagnant air of unspoken resentments. The usual buzz of extended family was there, a performance of festive cheer. My aunts and uncles offered forced smiles and the usual pleasantries. "Still working hard, Eldon?" one uncle asked, patting my shoulder, his tone suggesting it was a less impressive pursuit than Vernon's strategic initiatives. Vernon himself was holding court by the fireplace, looking sharp in a new sweater, laughing loudly at something my father said. He glanced at me a brief, almost pitying look before turning back to his audience. I felt the familiar sting of being the perpetual understudy, always in the wings, never on center stage. Dinner was a strained affair. Beneath the surface of polite conversation, the table was laden with food: turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, all the traditional comforts that felt like costumes tonight. I was seated near the end of the table, away from the head where my father sat and where Vernon was prominently placed to his right. Conversations flowed around me, focused on family gossip, Vernon's recent successes, and the latest golf scores. Every time I tried to contribute a point about the business or a recent challenge we'd overcome, my parents would steer the conversation back to Vernon's vision or a safer, more superficial topic. The air grew thicker with unspoken tension, a storm gathering behind my parents' seemingly relaxed smiles. I noticed them exchanging glances with Vernon, small, knowing looks that excluded me entirely. There was a sense of anticipation in their eyes, a readiness for something. My fork felt heavy in my hand, the perfectly cooked turkey tasting like ash in my mouth. Then my father stood up. He clinked his fork against his glass, the sound echoing through the sudden silence. Everyone turned to him, expectant smiles plastered on their faces. He began to speak, his voice booming slightly, starting with the usual platitudes about gratitude, family, and tradition. My heart, against my better judgment, fluttered with that last dying ember of hope. Maybe he was going to acknowledge all of us, maybe even me. But his eyes quickly settled on Vernon, his voice softened, filled with a warmth and pride I had yearned for my entire life. He spoke of the future, of taking the business to the next level, of leadership and vision. He talked about the qualities needed to lead, listing things I knew I possessed in abundance, but he attributed them all to Vernon. Vernon beamed under the praise, a smug, self-satisfied look spreading across his face. Then came the words, the ones that would forever cleave my life into before and after. My father looked directly at me, his smile fading into that familiar, slightly bored expression he reserved for my shortcomings. "Vernon is the future," he announced to the room, his voice regaining its volume. Then, quieter but cutting through the silence like a knife, he added, "You're just a disappointment." The world seemed to tilt. The background hum of the house disappeared. The smell of turkey vanished. All I heard was the ringing in my ears. All I saw was his face, the coldness in his eyes. He wasn't finished. Leaning forward slightly, a smirk playing on his lips, he twisted the knife deeper. "We knew you'd never amount to anything." The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of my own ragged breathing. I felt the eyes of everyone in the room on me, cousins, aunts, uncles, people I had shared holidays and family events with my entire life. Some looked shocked. Some looked away, unable to meet my gaze. Some I saw it on a few faces, a subtle nod, a silent agreement. They had heard the narrative my parents spun, and they believed it. I was the disappointment. Vernon was the golden child. It was confirmed, publicly, irrevocably. Then my mother, ever the conductor of the family orchestra, motioned to a waiting server. A tray of champagne flutes was brought out, already filled. They were ready for this. They had planned this. They were toasting my public humiliation, my official removal from the legacy I had helped build. My father and mother raised their glasses, their smiles returning, triumphant. Vernon raised his glass, looking awkwardly pleased with himself. The physical sensation was intense. My chest tightened as if someone had wrapped barbed wire around my lungs. My hands trembled slightly on the table. The humiliation was a hot, stinging wave, followed by a cold, paralyzing shock. But then something shifted inside me. The pain was immense, yes, but it was instantly cauterized by absolute, searing clarity. The last ember of hope died. The years of denial, of clinging to the belief that they would eventually see my worth, evaporated. They didn't see me. They never had. They saw a tool, a backup plan, something to be discarded when the preferred model was ready. In that moment, looking at their celebrating faces, the coldness in their eyes, the pre-planned champagne, I knew. I knew who they were. And I knew who I was. And I was not going to let their definition stand. A strange calm settled over me, born of the death of hope. It wasn't resignation, it was liberation. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor, a small jarring sound in the silent room. Every eye was on me. I met my father's gaze, then my mother's, then Vernon's. I managed a small, genuine smile, the kind that doesn't reach your eyes because there's a universe of pain behind it. My voice was quiet, perhaps a little shaky, but clear. "Thank you," I said, my gaze sweeping across their faces, taking in their sudden confusion, the halting of their celebration. "Thank you for the clarity." I let the words hang in the air, letting them understand or not understand the profound weight of what they had just done. I nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, not of defeat. Then I turned and walked out of the dining room, through the hallway filled with the ghosts of happier Thanksgivings, opened the front door, and stepped out into the cold November air. The sound of the door closing behind me felt like a final, decisive punctuation mark. The door shut behind me with a quiet finality. I walked to my car in a haze, the frigid November air biting at my skin. I welcomed the sting. It reminded me I was still real. Still alive. The tears didn't come right away. For a moment, I just sat behind the wheel, staring out into the dark driveway, lit by the yellow glow of porch lights and the dim flicker of candles through the window. Inside that house, people were lifting glasses in celebration. Of what, exactly, I still wasn't sure. My ousting? My devaluation? My erasure? I knew what it had meant to me. It meant freedom. Not the kind I'd wanted or imagined, but freedom nonetheless. As I pulled away from the house, I didn't have a destination. I just drove, letting the roads win me away from a life that had betrayed me. My eyes stung as the tears came, first slow, then heavy. By the time I turned onto a quiet road lined with tall pines, I had to pull over. I put the car in park and slumped over the steering wheel, shaking, sobbing in a way I hadn't since childhood. The grief was raw. Not just for the lost opportunity or the public shaming, but for something deeper, for the version of my family I'd wanted to believe in for so long. The version that had never truly existed. Eventually, the storm inside quieted, not because the pain was gone, but because something else had settled over it, resolve. Cold. Clear. Absolute. This was the bottom. There would be no return to who I had been before. But from the lowest place, I could finally see something new, a way forward. I drove to the only person I knew who wouldn't try to convince me to go back, to apologize, to make peace at my own expense. Sarah. Sarah and I had met in college, and over the years, she had remained one of the few constants in my life, fiercely loyal, endlessly pragmatic, and never once fooled by the Whitmore family image. When she opened the door to her apartment at midnight and saw my face, she didn't ask questions. She just stepped aside and hugged me. The first night I stayed at her place, I barely slept. I kept reliving the moment my father looked me in the eye and dismissed my entire existence in a single sentence. I kept hearing the glass clink, the polite laughter, the triumph in their voices. "I think you need to speak to someone," Sarah said the next morning, handing me coffee. "A professional. But also a lawyer." At first, I resisted. A lawsuit? Against my own family? It sounded like something out of a melodrama. But she wasn't wrong. What they'd done hadn't just been cruel, it had been calculated. Strategic. And from what she knew about the way the business was structured, potentially illegal. Sarah recommended an attorney she knew, Emily Carter, a business law specialist who had helped a friend of hers through a difficult family dispute. "She doesn't get emotional," Sarah said. "But she doesn't let people walk all over her either." Meeting Emily was like walking into a room where the temperature was set perfectly after coming in from a storm. She was calm, direct, and surprisingly empathetic. When I described what had happened, she didn't blink. "That's not just personal," she said after I finished recounting Thanksgiving. "That's potentially actionable." She asked me to bring her everything I had: emails, notes, records. Anything that showed my involvement in the business. Any financial documents I still had access to. Anything that could prove I had been not only a contributor but a key architect of operations. "I need you to understand something, Eldon," she said. "This isn't about revenge. It's about truth. It's about compensation. You've invested years of your life, and they used you as scaffolding, propping things up until they could decorate the top floor with someone else's name." I nodded. The analogy hit harder than I expected. I spent the next week combing through my files, backing up emails, collecting old reports, and retrieving handwritten notebooks I'd used during some of our major restructuring projects. It was painful, but also empowering, like unearthing my own buried legacy. And then I found it. In a storage bin I'd grabbed in a rush during a tense visit to my parents' house weeks before, I came across a manila envelope. Inside was a draft of a partnership agreement, one my father had created but never signed. It outlined a plan for Vernon and me to take over jointly once he stepped back, with specific roles and equity split based on our contributions. It had my name on it. It had been real. At least for a time. But the real treasure was the letter tucked behind it. It was from my grandfather, the founder of Whitmore Manufacturing. A handwritten note addressed to my father, expressing his vision for the business's future. In it, he detailed why he believed both of his grandsons, me and Vernon, were essential. I for my meticulous understanding of operations. Vernon for his people skills. Together, he wrote, they will be stronger than either alone. The letter was dated shortly before his death. It had been kept, then buried. I stared at it for a long time, feeling like I was reading a will that had been ignored. A ghost reaching through time to tell me I hadn't imagined my place in the family's future. It had once been promised. It had once been real. I brought everything to Emily. When she saw the letter, her eyes narrowed, and she gently laid it on the table beside her notes. "This," she said, tapping the paper, "isn't a contract. But it's intent. It's legacy. And with the draft agreement and your documentation, we have a story. A strong one." Then she looked at me, her tone careful but firm. "Are you ready to do this?" I thought of Thanksgiving. I thought of the champagne flutes, the smirk on my father's face, and the hollow echo of being called a disappointment in front of everyone I loved. I nodded. "Yes. I'm ready." Filing the lawsuit was not a dramatic event. There was no big announcement, no courtroom confrontation, just a stack of documents, carefully worded and quietly delivered. Emily submitted the initial complaint with precision. It wasn't an all-out assault. It was a scalpel, not a hammer. We were asking for an audit of my contributions, compensation for unpaid labor and intellectual property, and a formal review of succession decisions made without transparency or process. For me, it was never about dismantling the company. It was about recognition. Fairness. Truth. The reaction, however, was swift and exactly what I expected. My father called first. I let it go to voicemail. His voice thundered through the speaker when I finally listened. "You've lost your mind, Eldon. This is family. You don't sue your family." He didn't ask why. He didn't express concern. He didn't apologize. My mother sent messages too, her words laced with a familiar, suffocating guilt. We did everything for you. How could you bring lawyers into this? Think of what your grandfather would say. But I had thought of what my grandfather would say. His words were there, in black ink on that letter. He would say the truth matters more than the name on the door. And then there was Vernon. He didn't call. He didn't text. But a voicemail came through 2 days after the suit was filed. His tone was dismissive, vaguely amused. You've always needed a bigger stage, huh? Guess the courtroom is the next best thing. Good luck, little brother. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Everything went through Emily now. That was part of the new boundary. No more midnight phone calls. No more pleading with people who saw my value only when it was convenient. The hardest part wasn't the legal paperwork. It was the emotional toll, the unraveling of a belief I had clung to my entire life, that if I just worked hard enough, was just loyal enough, they'd see me. They'd love me in the way I needed. That illusion was gone. What replaced it was something stronger. Cleaner. Real. Emily began to build the case with precision. She requested internal memos, profit reports, HR records, all under my right as a longtime employee and family stakeholder. I helped compile the operational changes I'd implemented, the restructuring of logistics that saved hundreds of thousands, the vendor negotiations I'd personally handled, the transition to cloud-based systems I'd designed. My fingerprints were on nearly every major efficiency shift of the last decade. And yet, in public reports and marketing blurbs, only Vernon's name appeared. His smile. His handshake. His title. Emily's eyes lit up when she read through some of my notes. This is gold, she said. But it would help if we had an outside witness. Someone not related to the family. We got more than that. Mr. Quentin Holloway, former head of production, emailed me after hearing rumors about the legal action. He had retired 2 years earlier, moving to a small town in Vermont, but he'd kept detailed notes on the company's operations. He offered to help. I've stayed out of Whitmore drama, he told me when we spoke, but I always knew they weren't fair to you. You kept things running when nobody else could. I remember. I have the logs. His records were meticulous handwritten notes, annotated reports, even timestamped emails where projects I had completed were funneled through Vernon's desk for public credit. Emily almost laughed from disbelief as she reviewed them. They didn't even try to hide it. And then the piece de resistance, a memo from my father to Quentin, dated several years ago, instructing him to keep public-facing credit aligned with Vernon's role for continuity and investor appeal. In other words, Eldon works, Vernon gets the applause. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was systemic. With the grandfather's letter, the unsigned partnership draft, my personal documentation, and now Quentin's neutral testimony, Emily had everything she needed. We're going to mediation, she said. We sat across from my family in a sterile, glass-walled office downtown, our lawyers present, water glasses untouched. My parents looked exhausted, drawn. Vernon sat smugly, tapping his pen against the table like he was bored. The mediator, a kind, sharp woman named Rebecca, opened the discussion, but it was Emily who spoke for me. With calm authority, she presented the documents. The correspondence. The logs. The legacy letter. My father stayed quiet, his face a weathered mask. My mother sniffled once, then straightened. Vernon tried to deflect, pointing out everyone benefits the business in different ways. But the evidence was unshakable. The mediator turned to me at one point. Do you want to return to the company, Mr. Whitmore? I shook my head. No. I want the truth documented. And I want to be done. That moment felt like reclaiming my name. Not Whitmore, the brand. But Eldon, the person. The man who built systems and carried weight in silence. The man who wouldn't carry it anymore. The settlement came quietly. It included a financial payout, acknowledgement of my operational leadership, and a binding agreement that any future family marketing must credit me where appropriate. It wasn't public redemption, but it was official. And for me, it was enough. They had tried to erase me. But I had carved myself back into the record. The legal agreement was signed without fanfare. There were no apologies, only signatures, obligations, and a quiet exchange of glances that carried everything they would never say aloud. As I stepped out of that building, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: stillness. Not peace, not yet, but the absence of war. The relief of not having to look over my shoulder in my own family. The freedom to stop defending my truth. Sarah picked me up that afternoon and took me to a quiet diner just outside the city. We sat at a corner booth with mugs of coffee and no words for a while. "You don't look happy," she said finally, studying me. "I don't know what I look like," I replied. "I just know I'm not pretending anymore." That, in its own way, was joy. The settlement gave me more than money. It gave me permission to build a life that didn't depend on the approval of people who would never grant it. I moved into a new apartment on the edge of town. Small. Quiet. Mine. The first thing I unpacked was the letter from my grandfather. I framed it and hung it by the front door. A reminder that someone had seen me. Even if he hadn't lived to make it real. I started my own consulting business 3 months later. It was slow at first. Every new client came with doubts. Would they see me as capable? Would I finally be valued? But step by step, my work began to speak louder than my worries. One morning, an email arrived from a former vendor I'd worked with during my time at Whitmore. He had heard what happened and wanted to hire me to help streamline his logistics. "You were always the one who made things work," he wrote. That single sentence made me tear up more than any verdict. Other clients followed. Slowly. Organically. I wasn't building an empire, and I didn't want one. What I wanted was respect and the space to define success for myself. No champagne. No applause. Just dignity. And then, 6 months to the day after that final Thanksgiving, the call started. The first came at 9:02 a.m. My phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. Then another. Then my mother's name. Then my father's. They left voicemails. One after another. Some frantic. Some pleading. None apologizing. "Eldon," my mother cried, "we need your help. Things aren't going well. Your brother, Vernon, isn't managing the business well. Please, just talk to us." My father's voice followed. Tight. Angry. Still unwilling to yield. "Don't be petty. You know how this works. We need to fix this. Come back and make it right." He didn't mention what they'd done. He didn't mention the settlement. He didn't say "I'm sorry." The subtext was clear: Vernon had failed. The image had cracked. The golden child had tarnished under pressure. And now, they wanted the reliable son. The overlooked one. The one who knew how to build and not just talk. I played the messages once, then deleted them. There was no satisfaction in their panic. Only closure. They had made their decision in front of a dining room filled with family. They had raised glasses to my exile. Now they were drinking the bitter wine of consequence. And I was done. Sarah celebrated with me that evening, not the voicemails, but the choice I made not to answer them. "That," she said, raising her glass of ginger ale, "is the sound of freedom." I laughed. Not bitterly, but from somewhere new. Somewhere whole. I began to redefine family in the months that followed. Not just in theory, but in practice. I spent holidays with friends who treated me with care. I mentored a young entrepreneur who reminded me of myself 10 years ago, eager, uncertain, full of quiet fire. I volunteered at a local shelter once a month, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for back when I was chasing validation. And perhaps most importantly, I went to therapy. I unpacked years of seeking worth through achievement. I learned to sit with my pain, to honor it without letting it dictate who I was. The sessions weren't easy. But they were real. I stopped needing my parents to change. I stopped needing Vernon to understand. That was their journey. Mine was forward. One morning, I got a letter. A real one, no return address, just careful handwriting. Inside was a note from my cousin Sylvia. She had been at that Thanksgiving dinner. She wrote, "I saw what happened. I said nothing. I regret that. But I want you to know, I never believed them. I'm proud of you." I didn't need everyone's validation. But that one letter felt like sunlight on a long winter morning. The apartment I lived in wasn't grand. The company I ran wasn't flashy. But every corner of my life was mine. Earned. Honest. When people asked why I left Whitmore Manufacturing, I didn't share the full story. I just said, I wanted something of my own. That was enough. And when I passed the old headquarters on rare drives through town, I felt no hate. No ache. Just gratitude. Not for what they gave me. But for what they refused to. Because their denial forced me to discover who I really was, without their script, without their approval, without their applause. And that version of me? He's doing just fine. It's been almost 2 years now. Time has a strange way of healing, not by erasing pain, but by folding it into the fabric of your life until it no longer defines you. I still remember the look on my father's face when he told me I was a disappointment. I still recall the hollow clink of champagne glasses raised to my exclusion. But they no longer live at the center of my memory. They've become distant echoes. The center of my life now is peace. And work I believe in. And relationships that nourish, not drain. My consulting business never exploded into something massive, but it grew slowly, sustainably, through referrals and quiet success. I became known in niche circles as someone who could walk into chaotic systems and bring calm, order, efficiency. Clients appreciated that I didn't talk over them. That I didn't posture. I listened. I delivered. That was enough. The money is steady. The life it buys is modest, but filled with freedom. I no longer calculate every decision through the lens of legacy or approval. My value is not on trial. Every so often, I'm invited to speak at small business gatherings. I rarely mention my past, but when I do, I frame it with honesty, not bitterness. Sometimes, I say, the people you work hardest to impress are the least capable of seeing you. Don't waste your light trying to warm people who prefer the cold. The first time I said that, I saw someone in the back nod, wipe their eyes, and look at me like I had just handed them a compass. That's when I realized my story was no longer about loss. It was a lantern. In early spring, I visited my grandfather's grave for the first time in years. I brought the letter with me. The one he wrote to my father about Vernon and me. I didn't speak out loud, but I left the letter under a stone beside his name, weighted by a flat river rock I had carried since my therapy sessions started. It felt like the end of something and the beginning of something else. I haven't heard from my parents since that flurry of missed calls and messages over a year ago. Vernon tried to send a brief email at one point. Something vague about reconnecting and starting fresh. I deleted it. Not in anger. Just clarity. They didn't just lose a son or a brother. They lost a mirror, one that reflected truths they were unwilling to face. It was never really about me. It was about their expectations. Their fears. Their need to control a narrative that never fit the person I had become. I've learned to forgive them, but not in the way people often think. I didn't forgive because they apologized. I forgave because I refused to carry the weight of their failure to love me well. I still think about family, what it means, how we define it, how we choose it. I have one now. Not from blood, but from kindness, loyalty, shared values. People like Sarah, who remind me who I am when I forget. People I work with, mentor, support. People who show up, not because they have to, but because they want to. This is the life I built, not despite what happened that Thanksgiving, but because of it. That night marked the death of an illusion. And from that space, something more honest was born. If you had told me back then, sitting in that car with my head on the steering wheel, that I would one day feel grateful for what happened, I would have laughed bitterly. But now? I understand. Sometimes, clarity comes not as a gentle dawn but as a door slammed shut behind you. It leaves you in the cold. Alone. But that moment, that exile, can become sacred if you let it. Because when you are no longer welcomed where you were once devoted, you're finally free to build a place of your own. And that place? It is filled with light. Thank you for watching the video, like it if you watched the video to the end and don't forget to subscribe. Have a nice day.